Hi, my name is Kayla Miller, and today we will be discussing World War II and its cause and effects. World War II started on September 1st, 1939, and ended on September 2nd, 1945, almost exactly 5 years on the dot. The world practically split into two sides, the Axis powers and the Allied powers. The Allies are the blue, and the Axis are the red. The Axis powers consisted of Germany under Adolf Hitler, Italy under Benito Mussolini, and Japan under Emperor Hirohito. The Allied powers consisted of France and Great Britain under Winston Churchill, the US under Franklin Roosevelt, Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, and China under Chiang Kai-shek. So, how do you think World War II started? Well, a few things contributed to the start of World War II: the Spanish Civil War, the annexation of Austria, and the German invasion of Poland. The first year of the World War II was quite eventful. In August, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, which was the agreement that the two countries agreed to take no military action against each other for the next 10 years. In September, Germany made the first move and invaded Poland, which made a huge kickstart, and in November, Soviet Union invaded numerous countries in Poland. And by the end of the year, the US decided to stop all information regarding the exportation of fuel to Japan. The second year of the World War II was a bit livelier. In January, the Soviet-Poland War ended. In the months of April through June, Germany makes continuous strategic moves by invading Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and France. By July, the US cuts off the export of oil altogether. In September, Germany makes one of the most memorable moves of the war by doing an air raid over London. And finally, in October, the Polish Jews get pushed into parts of Warsaw. Touching back to one of the memorable moments of the war, the London air raid. Many people called it the Blitz. The Blitz was a strategic bombing of London with some of the newest weapons that the world had ever seen. First came the V-1, and then there was the V-2, which were essentially fighter aircraft that shot off cruise missiles. Many of the people were warned of this attack, so they had their own air raid shelter, which were called an Anderson shelter. For the others who didn't have their own, a total of more than 150,000 people went into underground stations where they slept on platforms. One of the many effects of the war that essentially became one of the biggest and well-known tragedies in history was the Holocaust. It was a mass murder of a little over 6 million European Jews, as well as members of some other persecuted groups, such as gypsies and homosexuals, by the German Nazi regime. To the anti-Semitic Nazi leader Adolf Hitler, Jews were an inferior race, an alien threat to German racial purity and community. As Nazi tyranny spread across Europe, the Germans and their collaborators persecuted and murdered millions of other people. Between 2 and 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were murdered or died of starvation, disease, neglect, or maltreatment. The Germans targeted the non-Jewish Polish intelligentsia for killing and deported millions of Polish and Soviet civilians for forced labor in Germany or in occupied Poland, where these individuals worked and often died under deplorable conditions. From the earliest years of the Nazi regime, German authorities persecuted homosexuals and others whose behavior did not match prescribed social norms. German police officials targeted thousands of political opponents, including communists, socialists, and trade unionists, and religious dissidents, such as Jehovah's Witnesses. Many of these individuals died as a result of incarceration and maltreatment. In the early years of the Nazi regime, the National Socialist government established concentration camps to detain real and imagined political and ideological opponents. Increasingly in the years before the outbreak of war, Soviet soldiers and police officials incarcerated Jews, Roma, and other victims of ethnic and racial hatred in these camps. To concentrate and monitor the Jewish population as well as to facilitate later deportation of the Jews, The Germans and their collaborators created ghettos, transit camps, and forced labor camps for Jews during the war years. The German authorities also established numerous forced labor camps, both in the so-called Greater German Reich and in German-occupied territory, for non-Jews whose labor the Germans sought to exploit. In the third year of the war, in 1941, the U.S. starts off the year with the Lend-Lease, allowing President Roosevelt to send ammunition and other war supplies to England. No longer a neutral nation, the United States now will give England all help short of war. In October, Japanese Army and Navy officers say Japan should get ready for war against the United States. General Hideki Tojo becomes prime minister in a military-controlled government, and a German submarine torpedoes the U.S. Navy destroyer Reuben James in the North Atlantic. It is the first U.S. warship sunk in the European War. Only 45 of the ship's 160 crew members survived. In November, Japan sends diplomats to Washington to try to find ways to avoid war. And finally, by the end of the year, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor in Germany, and Italy declare war on the U.S. Just before 8 a.m. on December 7, 1941, hundreds of Japanese fighter planes attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor near Honolulu, Hawaii. The barrage lasted just 2 hours, but it was devastating. The Japanese managed to destroy nearly 20 American naval vessels, including 8 enormous battleships and almost 200 airplanes. More than 2,000 American soldiers and sailors died in the attack, and another 1,000 were wounded. The day after the assault, President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan. Congress approved his declaration with just one dissenting vote. 3 days later, Japanese allies, Germany and Italy, also declared war on the United States, and again, Congress reciprocated. More than 2 years into the conflict, America had finally joined World War II. In April of 1942, first U.S. troops arrived in Australia. On the Bataan Peninsula of the Philippines, U.S. and Filipino troops, low on food and ammunition, surrender. Japanese troops forced about 76,000 prisoners to march to distant camps. At least 5,200 Americans die on the march. 16 U.S. bombers, led by Lieutenant James Doolittle, take off from an aircraft carrier 800 miles off Tokyo and make the first bombing air raid against Japan. In June, U.S. carrier-based aircraft alerted to Japanese moves by code breakers stop a Japanese invasion of Midway, a U.S. base that guards Hawaii. U.S. dive bombers sink 4 Japanese carriers. 1 U.S. carrier is lost. The Battle of Midway is the turning point of the Pacific War, and in September, an aircraft launched from a Japanese submarine drops firebombs on forests near Brookings, Oregon, in the first bombing of the continental United States. Kicking off 1943, Japan's attempt to take New Guinea ends as Australian and U.S. troops defeat Japanese troops at landing sites. Australia is no longer threatened by invasion. German troops surrender at Stalingrad. The Soviet Red Army, turning the tide of the war, begins an offensive that will end in the capture of Berlin, and in September, Italy finally surrenders. Next came the slow descent of ending the war, starting with June 6, 1994, better known as D-Day. 155,000 Allied troops land on the beaches of Normandy, France, to begin the liberation of Europe. By August, Paris is liberated. By the end of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge had begun, where German forces launched a surprise attack in the region of Belgium. Kicking off the last year of the war, the largest land battle by U.S. troops ever was fought. Then in March, B-29s bombed Tokyo, burning half the city. More than 80,000 people died, and the U.S. 8th Air Force bomber, about 1,250 in all, attacked Berlin in the heaviest air raid made on the city. In April, U.S. soldiers freed 32,000 survivors of the Dachau concentration camp. It will become a memorial for victims of the Nazi Holocaust, and the Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler kills himself. On May 7th, Germany finally surrenders, but the violence didn't stop there. when in August of 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, killing up to at least 100,000 people. Now, brushing up on a few of the major points within the last 2 years of the World War, the first is D-Day, or also known as the Battle of Normandy, which lasted from June 1944 to August 1944. It resulted in the Allied liberation of Western Europe from Nazi Germany's control. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the battle began on June 6, 1944, also known as D-Day, when some 156,000 American, British, and Canadian forces land on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the heavily fortified coast of France's Normandy region. The invasion was one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history and required extensive planning. Prior to D-Day, the Allies conducted a large-scale deception campaign designed to mislead the Germans about the intended invasion target. By late August 1944, all of northern France had been liberated, and by the following spring, the Allies had defeated the Germans. The Normandy landings have been called the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. Next is the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where an American B-29 bomber dropped the world's first deployed atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion wiped out 90% of the city and immediately killed 80,000 people. Tens of thousands more would later die of radiation exposure. 3 days later, a second B-29 dropped on another A-bomb on Nagasaki, killing an estimated 40,000 people. Japan's Emperor Hirohito announced his country's unconditional surrender in World War II in a radio address on August 15, citing the devastating power of a new and most crucial bomb. In conclusion, after World War II, the world started a new era. The USSR and the US became competitors. The United Nations was created, and it increased the rate of decolonization. And finally, there was a sudden rise of the People's Republic of China. Thanks for listening.